All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Michael Martin Luther King, but we're not only going to be talking about MLK, we're also going to be talking about the Civil Rights Act and, by the grace of God, why it should be repealed. So, without further ado, here we go. Martin Luther King Jr. has been one of the most important civil rights figures since the day of his death in 1968. Our society has come to view him as a mythic figure who both defied an oppressive system while preaching a Christian message of inclusion, peace, and tolerance. This is not true, and sadly, many Christians have been deceived into celebrating a heretic theologian, a sexual deviant, and a Marxist agent. What is even worse, though, is that the Civil Rights Project has used MLK to pollute the mission of Christianity and to destroy the historic identity of the United States. Here we go.
All right, well, welcome everybody. We're excited about this topic, and I was tasked with writing the kind of background article for the topic this week, and then we remembered that it was MLK Day on Monday, and so on Sunday, Wes said, hey, what do you think about doing something about MLK? So we scrapped the previous topic, and we jumped into kind of an analysis of MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and particularly the movement that was launched kind of by or through his name, right? Yep. Through his image, the heroic martyr figure that MLK became and has become in our society. It launched a civil rights movement that was, I think, well beyond what anyone at the time when MLK was alive would have even thought or dreamed or expected or feared or whatever adjective that we want to put in there, and really has been devastatingly harmful to religion, to Christianity, to the nation in general. And so what we want to do today is we want to talk, these are kind of shocking claims, right? Especially if you grew up going to elementary school and seeing pictures of MLK and he's a hero and nothing bad has ever been said about him. So we want to do a little bit of background work. A lot of people have done it so far this year. We were talking before we started that the Overton window on MLK is shifting quite a bit. Right. People are starting to kind of reevaluate his history. But there are a couple things we want to say about his theology, his heretical theology, his sexual practices, which were gross and deviant, and then also just the fact that he was so closely aligned to Marxism. So a little bit of biography to start, and then we'll jump into some other topics, including why the church has kind of swallowed it hook, line, and sinker, and then the damage it's done to society in general.
Right. Real quick, when Michael talks about the Overton window, what he's saying is, the Overton window has been used to just describe as a descriptor for acceptable public discourse, the kind of speech that doesn't cause you to lose all your friends, what's acceptable to say. And it really is remarkable thinking that in just 6 years, so it wasn't that long ago, we're not talking about 60 years, but 6 years ago, 2018, you had the MLK 50 conference with guys like David Platt, and I think John Piper was probably the only one who even mentioned that there might be something negative about the man, Michael, Martin Luther King. But everybody else was just praise, complete praise. And that was 6 years ago, and nobody, including myself, and I just want to say that from the get-go, including myself. Now, granted, I didn't have the platform that I have today, and so, nobody really would have heard it, but regardless, nobody, including myself, was doing an episode like we're about to do, where it really takes a serious look at MLK and says, hey, there's massive problems with this guy, and not just with his character behind the scenes, but actually the way that he was weaponized and used, and even his own purposes and the Civil Rights Act and what that has become. Nobody was talking about the problems of the Civil Rights Act. I'd highly recommend for your own time reading The Age of Entitlement, not The Enlightenment, but The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell, who just perfectly exposes why the Civil Rights Act was unjust, especially in what it accomplished, but even in paper. And so those are the things that we're talking about. And, to think that there's only two figures in terms of persons, right? There's other holidays that we have, but in terms of federal holidays, I believe it's only two. We have George Washington, and then we have, we have Martin Luther King. And so to be elevated, almost deified to that level of federal holiday for somebody who is like, well, George Washington had problems. No, not like MLK, not even close. So
We'll take down Robert E. Lee's statutes.
Yes.
We'll tear them down. An incredible, godly man, a leader, disciplined. We'll take those down. And they say, but don't you touch his legacy. Oh, let him have his day. Oh, maybe he did have his flaws, but let's leave that be. Let's leave the holiday. Meanwhile, we'll take William Penn down from Pennsylvania. We'll take Lee down. We'll destroy those heroes.
Right. Yep. Okay.
Good. All right, so a couple things about King, and if this is new information to you, then buckle up. It's kind of shocking, and it begs the question of how on earth has this man become such a figure? But Martin Luther King, flatly put, was a heretic. I read several of his papers from seminary this week, and he flatly denies the virgin birth, the deity of Christ, the inerrancy of Scripture, and oh boy, there was one other one that I put in here. But bodily resurrection, just the bodily resurrection, no big deal. Claiming, his basic claim was the early church had to appeal to this wide Greek audience, and they had this intensely, almost surreal experience, wandering and traveling and working alongside Christ. And after he died, they had to try and figure out ways to explain the experience that they had. And it was like, we were with him, and it was almost otherworldly, right? It was almost divine to be with Christ. And so his theory, and he was reading other people who were saying this, he went to liberal seminaries. The theory was, well, the Greeks had this conception of the spirit and of the divine, and so the early church, in their attempts to explain how they felt when they were with Christ, the disciples, and in an attempt to appeal to this very kind of philosophical Greek time, they ended up kind of inventing these ideas of deity, of superhuman father, kind of like a Zeus figure, and Hercules. And so they
believed crazy things like a global flood.
Exactly.
All over the whole earth.
Right. Literally, it was a local flood, but they just exaggerated it to, no.
Yep. And
we believe in a global flood.
Amen to that. Here's the thing, though. A lot of people have said, well, that was earlier. That was when he was in seminary, and he went to a liberal seminary because the conservatives ones wouldn't let him in. There's no evidence that he ever recanted on this. In fact, the guy at Stanford who put together his papers in the 90s was corresponding with his wife, Coretta Scott King, and basically said, like, he wasn't criticizing. He was saying, look, the evidence from King's papers is that he was very far away from Orthodox Christianity. And that was the guy who compiled all of them together. So
I also think that's just insulting to black people. What that implies is that King wasn't Orthodox because the white seminaries wouldn't let him in, which implies, okay, well then none of the other black people at that time went to white seminaries, and so they all must have been heretics. And that's just false. The black community was thriving before the Civil Rights Act in many different places, and they were thoroughly Orthodox. Now the black church today, sadly, has many unorthodox opinions and certainly poor views as it comes to civil politics, but black Christians, and that's a generalization. That's not every black individual. We've got Vody Baucham and Daryl Harrison and Virgil Walker. They're great guys. But in general, the black church today is not great. But the black church and the black community, in just a more general sense of yesteryear, was, in fact, I think Thomas Sowell talks about this. There was actually more parents or more married households. I think it was like close to 80% or something, or maybe even close to 90% of fathers and mothers staying together and children being raised in a two-parent home with their biological parents than the white community of that time. Whereas today, I think it's like 75% of black children are raised in a single-parent home, usually with the absence of a father. So my whole point is just to say, it's you can't, for anyone who say, well, MLK was a heretic, but that's because white people had a monopoly on orthodoxy. And you couldn't that right there denies the perspicuity of Scripture, the clarity of that somebody sitting at home reading the Bible couldn't have a clue about the resurrection of the dead, and we would just reject that. I have training in multiple regards, but technically I don't have an MDiv. I don't have formal seminary training in that regard, and yet I still somehow found a way in reading the Scripture just as a Christian. To come to the conclusion that Jesus bodily rose from the dead, and that we too, he was raised as a first fruits, and that we too, So I just completely reject the idea that it's Whitey's fault that MLK held heretical views.
Does exactly that. They have this Q&A about the complexities of King, and he says, well, I was 15, I had a crisis of faith, and so who are we to discount, like his crisis of faith? Well, hang on, there's a huge difference between a 15-year-old saying, like, I have some questions, mom and dad, to someone in seminary for their doctorate, sitting down, not in one day or an evening, writing their whole doctorate. This doesn't seem to be real. Think we can deny this. There's a huge difference, and like you said, it's almost demeaning and insulting to King to say this is some crisis of faith. He just didn't have access to the education, and that's Russell Moore, head of the ERC at the time.
King never recanted any of those things, at least publicly, that we can find.
Right. So it wasn't a moment. It's not a midlife crisis. It's your whole life crisis. Your whole life. So okay.
So heretic, sexual deviant. I don't know, Wes. Do you want to jump in on this a little bit?
Oh, it's a nice, nice easy topic.
Throw you the easy one.
Yeah. Just to speak with grace and but also clarity. He had multiple adulterous affairs. The FBI, they actually wiretapped him. They were suspicious, and we'll get into this, of him obviously being connected to individuals with Marxist and communist connections. And so the FBI wiretapped him, and so they had kind of unparalleled access to his private life, to listen to him, his discussions. It was very vulgar in private. And Trump actually declassified this. And to be fair, I don't think it was available until 2019.
That's true.
So this is somewhat newer. MLK 50 wasn't around. But there was a woman being assaulted in the background, and Martin Luther King is laughing. He's laughing and actually giving advice. He was a twisted, wicked man. There's tons of other details on them. They're not worth repeating. They shouldn't be repeated. He was not a committed family man. He was an adulterer through and through. And I think almost the theme would just be indulgent. It wasn't even like there are people that, I don't know. They give into a temptation once, but they regret it. Right. I sinned. I left myself open to temptation, and I have failed miserably. I want to rebuild that. And then there's just indulgence, drunkenness, works of darkness, orgies, sexual assault, those things. That's what he was much more characterized than a moment of infidelity.
Right. It wasn't a moment. It was a lifestyle.
Absolutely.
Again and again. Correct me if I'm wrong, but allegedly, so I already protected myself a little bit. That allegedly word, that gets you a long way. But allegedly he was in an affair, and perhaps even a multiple person, an orgy, even just a few days before his assassination.
I think the night before he was assassinated.
So this wasn't like, he had a bad season in his 20s, and then lived for 30 years. Right. And then lived for 30 years repenting of that, and then was assassinated. This is all the way up till the night before.
Yeah. Unrepentant, indulgent.
And was funding some of these escapades with money that was donated through charities for training Black urban leaders. So this was going on behind the scenes at some of these weekend training seminars that they were doing.
Real quick, I want to address, we have just one comment on the screen, so anybody who's hopping on the video can see it. And so I think it's worth addressing. The name is Wokey McWokerson. Oh, I'm sorry, A. Allen. He says, if you whistle for the white supremacists, don't be shocked when they arrive. So you're being foolish. So basically what A. Allen is insisting here, or outright implying, is that by having a video like this, titling it, something negative about Martin Luther King, telling the truth about Martin Luther King and the negative effects that have come from the Civil Rights Act, that you're whistling for white supremacists. And the reality is, unfortunately, some things are inevitable. I have no doubt that there are, with 85,000 YouTube subscribers, that that there's probably a couple people who are just genuinely bona fide white supremacists. That's probably the case. But one, Jesus died for white supremacists. Everybody's fine with, we were just talking before we started recording and saying, like, given these two scenarios, if you in your past had two events, one of these two events, in one case, you pressured your girlfriend to get an abortion. But you repented and said, this is wrong, and I don't ever want to be like that again. And then in the other case, in your past, you had some kind of engagement where you said something racist, to a black person. But again, you repented. I don't ever want to do that again. Which of those two things would be more forgivable? If there was a public record of both of those events, like which one would follow you to the grave in society today? Exactly. And so one, white supremacists are sinners who need Jesus, and I actually want to minister to them instead of telling them that that's the one unforgivable sin. We'd carve out miles and miles of allowances for LGBT, for sodomy. But absolutely, the blood of Christ, there's no room to apply it to this one sin of racism. So I reject that. Secondly, if addressing the problems that are going down, the overreactions, the way that things have gone the other direction, reverse racism, which is a thing, if even mildly addressing that is a whistle for white supremacists, then just bring it on. That's not my intention. That's not what I want to happen, but that is a casualty that I will gladly endure because this has to be addressed. And we just have to be honest for a moment. There's only one race that is discriminated against. I don't even like using the word race because we're the human race. We all descended from Adam and Eve, but one ethnicity, you could use that word. There's only one ethnicity in our country, at least in the U.S. Today, and I would argue in many parts of Europe as well, but there's only one ethnicity that legally on the books and with academia and schools and in the workplace, and there's only one ethnicity that has legal objective prejudices against it, and it's not the black community, it's white people. We live in a world that is racist. And not racist, spelled R-A-Y, but like legitimately racist against one ethnicity, white people. And we think that that's wrong. We think it's wrong if it's against minorities, and we think it's wrong if it's against white people. We think it's wrong, period. And so we want to talk about it. And if one of the repercussions, not the intended consequence, but a casualty is that white supremacists get excited and start listening to my podcast, great, then maybe they'll hear the gospel and get saved. Okay, so A.A. Allen, a.k.a., I think you misspelled your name, Wokey McWokerson, buzz off. All right, real quick, we'll get back to it, but let's go to a quick word from our first sponsors of the day. Did you know that fresh American black elderberries are naturally high in vitamin C, vitamin B6, phosphorus, and vitamin A, as well as many anthocyanins that serve as antioxidants? Regular supplementation with elderberry extracts has been shown to decrease chance of influenza and lessen cold duration and symptoms. The Kings Ridge fresh frozen elderberries are hand-picked, destemmed, washed, and quickly frozen at their family farm in East Central Indiana. The Kings Ridge is a quality-oriented family farm focused on building Christendom. Our friends Trevor and Autumn truly hope that their elderberry syrup and fresh frozen elderberries bless your family this cold and flu season. Don't buy dried European elderberries and support the global economic agenda. Instead, visit tkrfarm.com and purchase your elderberry needs from the Kings Ridge Elderberries. Again, that's tkrfarm.com. Finally, a coffee company that doesn't hate you and your beliefs. Today's sponsor, Squirrelly Joe's Coffee, is a thoroughly Christian company that ships seriously good coffee straight to your front door. Owned and operated by Joe Morris and his family out of Olney, Illinois. They believe that Christians should be building a thoroughly Christian economy by doing business with other like-minded Christians. Just go to squirrellyjoes.com and use promo code RRM for 20% off your purchase. Squirrelly Joe's Coffee, share coffee, serve humbly, live faithfully. All right, if you're just now joining us, here we go. We've covered Michael Martin Luther King. I keep doing that because Martin Luther was not actually his real name, but Michael King. We've covered so far his sexual deviancy in the past regarding his character, also his dogma and doctrine that was absolutely heretical, not just that he would disagree on secondary or tertiary items, but denying the bodily resurrection, big ticket items. So we've talked about his doctrine and we've talked about his life in terms of character, but now we want to talk about some of his political affiliations and fidelity, his allegiance. And then we want to, for those of you who are just now joining us, the big thing that we want to address in this episode is not so much Martin Luther King. Yeah. A lot of people actually did that on Monday, which was encouraging to see. And a lot of people did it truthfully. The Overton window, acceptable discourse, really has shifted quickly. And so we don't want to spend all our time on Martin Luther King. So we'll hit the Marxist political side of it with MLK. But then moving forward from that, the big focus is going to be the Civil Rights Act, problems with the Civil Rights Act. I'm putting that on people's radar.
Yeah, great. So what's interesting to me in talking about MLK being a Marxist is that in the time that we live in now, that might not even be bad, right? Like I'm going to read a quote in a moment, but MLK could not talk about his Marxist affiliations in the 60s because of his public ministry. In other words, it was so assumed that to be aligned with Marxist was unbiblical, wicked, and evil. He couldn't mention it. It had to be on the down low. Now, if a guy is associated with Marxist tendencies or, is part of the Communist Party or whatever, it's like, well, they're well-intentioned. They're doing their best to make the world better. It's better anyway. Yeah, exactly. Yep. And so even to see in that sense, like MLK had to hide this at the time. Now, I don't think he would. I don't think he would have to necessarily because we're not convinced that Marxism is an evil, objectively evil, damaging, destructive, and ungodly worldview. Okay? But as far as the Marxism goes, again, this also comes from the wiretaps that Wes mentioned that the FBI had on him. And so this is a quote from Levinson, Stanley Levinson, who was King's legal counsel, advisor, kind of a guy who was in his organization. And he was recommending King to another man named Gus Hall. Gus Hall was the general secretary of the Communist Party of America. And so this was Levinson trying to communicate to Hall, yeah, well, you should trust King. He's on our side with this. He sees the world the way you did. And this was what Levinson said to Hall. He said, King is a wholehearted Marxist who has studied it, Marxism, believes in it, and agrees with it. But because of his being a public minister of religion, does not dare to espouse it publicly. And so there was a real connection between King and one of the things that we need to realize is that when communism failed, when Marxism failed in Europe, the people who were sympathetic to Marxism did not go away. They moved to the U.S. They started, the Frankfurt School, and a lot of thinkers and philosophers continued to believe that the world needed to be viewed through conflict, oppression, and oppressor. And in Russia, it had been the rich and the poor.
Right.
But they said, okay, that's not going to work in America because the middle class is so content.
Right, because capitalism had worked so well.
Yes.
Now today, to be fair, there are problems with capitalism, especially crony capitalism. And we may do an episode on decrying some of the evils of capitalism. But that said, at the time, what we were experiencing with this is before the 80s, this is before shipping every job overseas, so you can pay pennies on the dollar and put your factory in China or whatever. But this was, America's heyday. And so like the 40s and the 50s and capitalism was working, and it was more ethical versions of capitalism, still some problems, but it was working so well that the class warfare in terms of economic class that worked in other places, because the gap between, there was no middle class. Middle class was a unicorn. That was not even a category. It was the bourgeoisie and the peasants, right? So it's the rich and the poor. And so that would work. If you see people are super rich and then you can't eat, then you're angry and you might rally. You might form a revolution. But in America, you try that Marxist tactic, and the majority of America is the middle class, and they're saying, well, yeah, my boss, he makes 10 times more than me because he started the company, and I actually admire that. But what he's paying me, I own a home, I have a car. Now, granted, they did way better than us, and part of it is they were frugal. It's like we drink Folgers. It tastes like coffee that was mixed in a sock, kind of like Starbucks. But we're fine with it. And so they were content. They weren't dropping $6 every single morning on crappy coffee at Starbucks. They were dropping 6 cents for crappy coffee at home. But the point is still, they owned a home. They owned a car. They did 2 weeks of vacation. They mowed their grass, and their kids were fed, and all these things were. So that just wasn't economic class warfare. Wasn't incentivizing enough to get a revolt. So they knew in America, especially given its history with the transatlantic slavery and race-based slavery, they're like, "There's your ticket." That's how you get.
And so
division.
they intentionally drove a wedge. They looked for a fracture in American society. And they chose, it was an intentional choice, the black and white conflict of the past. And so the Marxist movement, what we have to understand, really preceded the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There were forces and philosophies that were trying to drive wedges and destroy American integrity, and they picked the black and white issue. Now, obviously, there were problems. Jim Crow was a problem. Great. But the point that we need to realize is that there were forces, evil forces, that preceded the Civil Rights Act and the legislation that's come since then, and that King allied himself with those forces.
Right.
And a lot of Christians, they did the same. So a lot of pastors, a lot of parishioners, they would have been a part of the civil rights movement. And I do think that many of them were genuine. And that's actually why communism and Marxism, they're so pernicious. We actually had a saying in this country, better dead than red. It was better to be dead than to be a communist, than to be so evil. It's such a reprehensible ideology. But what it does is it comes in and it says, like, to the poor person, like, well, don't you feel bad for the poor? Don't you want to see them raised up? Which the answer should be, of course. We want to see human flourishing. But they'll come in and they'll say, don't you care about these poor workers? Let's go ahead and raise them up. Now, what they mean by raise them up is let's go ahead and steal.
Right.
Let's eliminate the class above, plunder them, and redistribute their wealth. So they'll sneak that little part in there. Same thing when it came to civil rights. Like, don't you care for this community that has been segregated, that have their own schools, they can't vote, this, that, or the other? Don't you want to see equality? Now, really what they mean by equality is actually like you said earlier, a reverse racism where now the whites are the out group. We'll just go ahead and switch this. And a lot of good Christians went along with it. Well, I care about the least of these. Well, I care about the poor. Well, I care about justice. Co-opting those terms, it would be closer to a cultural Marxism rather than economic
and these
Marxism.
guys were platformed by major evangelical institutions and conferences, guys like Jamar Tisby, The Color of Compromise, and they weren't saying don't be racist. They were saying, in fact, they were saying it's not enough not to be racist. You have to be anti-racist, which means racism, discrimination in the other direction, right? That white people have gotten ahead too far, and the only way that we can actually have equity, equal outcomes, rather than equality, equal opportunity, is we actually have to punish, white people, the white community in this nation, and we actually have to steal from them.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, it's so relevant for our time, but he describes that was the way that they would interrogate people. It wasn't enough just to be, well, I'm not communist, but I'm not against. You had to be ardently towards, and they would put the burden of proof on you. You have to prove that you're not anti-communist, which was impossible. And he literally would say, like, the only standard of justice was this interrogator's dialectical, atheistic, whatever sense he was feeling that day. That is cultural Marxism. You're guilty. You have to ardently show, ardently espouse this. And if your enthusiasm doesn't even reach the level we want it to, guilty. Condemned.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to pick up on what you said in terms of, both of you guys said, in terms of, MLK not wanting to be publicly seen with his affiliations with Marxism. That it's funny that a serial adulterer who actually was a Marxist was ashamed to be publicly aligned with Marxists. And then in 2020, BLM, which is explicitly labeled itself on their website publicly as a Marxist organization, you got MLK, who was a bad pastor, a heretic, who even he has enough shame, to say, I don't want people to know I'm a Marxist. And then you have in 2020, you have evangelical pastors who are marching with BLM as they close down their churches for COVID, right? So they won't meet and administer the Lord's Supper and preach the scripture, but they will go in large crowds and march with BLM, which is publicly listed, on their own website, self-declared as Marxist. So that just, shows the shifting. So we're talking about the Overton window. It shifted drastically from MLK to 2020, and by God's grace, I do think that there's some pushback and shifting back in the right direction. But
however much you hate communism and Marxism, you don't hate it enough. It is one of the most evil ideologies with the greatest body count in this century. You need to despise it deeply. You need to hate your own sin, yes, but this is one ideology, philosophy, a worldly one, that must be destroyed top to bottom.
Yeah.
And Wes, you and I were talking about this over the week, and you made the comment, and I agree with you. I just want to give you credit that this possibly is the most formidable philosophy, false worldview that Christianity has had to deal with so far, right? Yeah. And it is a cancer that just, because it arrived in a postmodern time too, where now making truth claims is no longer valid. And so we can't make objective claims about the evils of Marxism and cultural Marxism because someone says, yeah, but I feel like we should be nicer to people. And that has equal weight with, yeah, but look at the body count in Russia,
Right.
or the USSR, or not even the USSR. It was, the
Tens of millions.
yeah, tens of millions.
China as well.
Yep. Yeah.
Good point.
Yep.
All right. So now I think let's go ahead and shift gears and talk about Civil Rights Act.
So I owe a lot of my thinking on this matter to the book that Joel mentioned earlier.
Mention it again.
Yeah, The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell.
Yep.
And in the book, he points out his central thesis is that, number one, there was a bait and switch, that America thought it was getting one thing with the Civil Rights Act, and it was actually given something entirely different, right? And that appeals to kind of the goodwill that you were talking about. A lot of people of goodwill said, yeah, we should end Jim Crow, right? This is bad, okay? And they thought, okay, we'll pass civil rights laws, and all of a sudden, we'll have guaranteed equality under the law for all citizens, all people in the country, and now we can move on. But what really happened was the civil rights legislation of the 60s, which was different, by the way, than the civil rights legislation of 1866, which basically just made all people citizens and able to operate under the full privileges of the law.
Equal protection. Yeah.
Yep. What happened was it built this, number one, moral purity that people began to require that everyone else in the nation have. You must be actively, if you're white, you have to feel guilty. And if you, everyone else, you have to be actively in favor of crushing any sort of perceived is the key word, perceived inequality. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, the legislation for a lot of this, while the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress, what happened was they set up a whole bunch of bureaucratic panels. And so judges would make rulings about certain aspects of life, or not life, the law, and then a non-elected bureaucratic panel would come in, and it would say, okay, now because of that, we have to do this, we have to do that. And so it ended up being this huge club that was leveled against American society, and a huge change in the function of what is good and evil, right? A huge perspective shift on right and wrong, morality, the purpose of religion, Christianity. All of this changed as a result of the civil rights legislation. And I would argue, Caldwell doesn't say it, but the Marxist pressure that was behind it all. So that's one place to start.
I was going to say too, the early 1960s were a time of a lot of upheaval. You had the assassination of JFK. You had the wars that were kind of ending and drawing down. You had the baby boomer generation. And this happened really, really quickly. So you have JFK's assassination, who was on the forefront of pushing civil rights legislation. Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, comes in and begins to spearhead this. And he kind of packages it as JFK's last wish. Like, to honor his legacy, we need to push this all the way through. We need to ram it all the way through. The American public was actually saying this is going too fast. So as there were polling people, they were saying, how do you feel about the progress in the Civil Rights Act, these different statutes? It's looking like it's going to pass. And a lot of them were saying, actually, this is too fast. I don't know what we're getting into. It's saying this, but couldn't this be weaponized against? Like, one of the criticisms was, well, won't this mean that we have to do busing, which means to make schools equal, it has to have equal proportion black here and equal proportion black here. Won't that lead to busing? All the critics were like, no, it won't do that. And then 5 years later, they're like, yeah, actually, now because of this law from the top down, all the way at the federal government, we do now have to bus across town to make sure that these schools are equal. So they got
that sounds like I'm cracking up because it makes me think. I'm just picturing Obama with the Obamacare. It's like, this won't make your health insurance go up. I promise it won't do that. That one didn't even take 5 years, but almost immediately, it's like my insurance doubled. So. But yeah, that's the play. It's like, no, we're just saying this. But then what you do, and again, this is, to be fair, to right real problems. Now, not always. Sometimes it's just a farce. But sometimes there are real problems like Jim Crow. Things that actually are against God's law, that actually are wrong, that actually are sinful. And so you're writing a real problem, but you're writing a problem with the wrong tool. Like it's an overreaction, or you're doing something that this does right the problem, but it creates something that can be weaponized to create a new problem. Real quick, I just wanted to read the 14th Amendment, because in terms of the Civil Rights Act, well, where would it be rooted? Like where constitutionally, where do you find the lenience in order to have this act in the first place? So 14th Amendment says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So a couple comments on that real quick. First, keywords, phrase, no state. But the way that the Civil Rights Act was immediately, well, not immediately, but soon began to be employed and used, was not in regards to the state pertaining to legality and laws, equal protection under the law, equal opportunity under the law, equal rights under the law, equal right to defense, and all those kinds of things, attorney, all that kind of stuff. That wasn't the end of it. What quickly happened was it got out of the realm of the state, and it was applied to free enterprise, to private businesses in terms of who they should hire by law, legally, and also not just in their hiring practices, but even in their patronage, and who they had to allow into their store, and who they had to serve, and all these kinds of things. And for the record, I'm not saying. I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that a bunch of white businesses, serving blacks in the back alley, or in the kitchen because they're not allowed, was a good thing. That's not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is that by the power of the gospel, and with the change, the gospel affecting culture, that culturally, without the state having to get involved, without a law necessarily being put in place, culturally, what would, I believe, inevitably have happened is that white businesses that were genuinely racist, that had no reason for suspicion towards a certain people group or something, but they were genuinely racist. It was rooted in anger or envy or whatever it might have been. I believe that over time, and not over hundreds of years, but within less than a decade, they would have naturally gone out of business, because the people, as the culture was changing, being informed by the gospel and these kinds of things, I think that the people would have said, hey, we've got two choices for pancakes. You can eat at Mr. Racist Pancake House, or you can eat at this other pancake house. And naturally, so people would have shifted their patronage, and you punish the businesses in that way. But instead, you think about this for a second. How has this been used? The way that this has been used is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, with Delta Airline, to where like all of a sudden now you have to. It's not even diversity anymore. They're championing and bragging about having an all-black crew or an all-women's crew, or it's not diversity. It's actually mono-ethnic or mono gender, but in the opposite direction. And then you have doors of the airplane flying off in midair because they didn't go for the best pilot. They didn't go for merit. They didn't go for the most experience or hours being clocked in. They just went for what's politically correct. And so now you have to, like, if you fly Delta, you seriously need to call into question your safety. Like, if you're flying Delta, you need to kiss your wife and kiss your kids,
check the pilot,
and let them know it is, it's always, nobody knows what God has for us, or nobody can number his days. But if you're flying Delta, you can just about number your days. The number of your days is how many days you have between now and your next flight with Delta. So all that being said, my point is that's how it got used. And one other factor, and we don't have to go, I'll throw it back to you guys, but one other factor that has to be considered is that the Civil Rights Act paved the way for LGBT madness, and the whole LGBT LMNOP, mafia. They hijacked the Civil Rights Act and said, we're included in this too. This is talking about us too. We are a people group. We're a group dynamic, and this is my orientation. It starts at birth. This isn't a choice. It's not a lifestyle. It's who I am. Just like the color of your skin. This too is innate to my identity. And then all of a sudden, it's not just that you have to enforce certain practices. Like the Civil Rights Act, there's a direct line from that to affirmative action.
Well,
right?
Because successive bills that were passed regarding civil rights kept adding protected classes.
Right, exactly.
Right. So originally it was just whether you had been a slave or not in 1866. And then it was race, ethnicity, sex, that sort of thing. And the list keeps going. And so we have what Wes said earlier is now all the way down to basically what's in place is anyone who can claim to be oppressed, anyone who can complain to be a victim.
And claim that they have some kind of innate identity.
And claim that they have some sort of innate identity. And then the definition of that oppression is they just won't let me do what I want.
Right.
Anyone can now be given protected class status. And now all of the weight of all of the laws and rulings over the last decades suddenly, quote unquote, protects them.
And here's the demonic irony, if I could say that phrase just one more time, going back to the 14th Amendment. First, it's not saying private businesses. It's not saying churches. It's not saying this. It says states, the government, the civil magistrate must be exercise equality, not equity, equality of outcome, but equality of equal protection, equal opportunity, those kinds of things in a legal sense for all people groups. But it got applied to the private sector. It got applied in all these other ways. And here's the demonic irony, and I think it's a proper phrase. The thing that's actually in the 14th Amendment is, in a legal sense, one of the things, just to read it again, is nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. What I would say is not in the 14th Amendment is the Civil Rights Act. What I would say is in the 14th Amendment, in terms of a people group that is punished by the state and not offered equal protection, there's only one group. It's not black, it's not white, it's the unborn. The unborn on the books. We're not talking about private enterprises. We're talking about laws. On the books, legally, there's only one class of people, one group of people in these United States that don't have equal protection, meaning that you can harm them, or more specifically in this case, kill them and rip them up into literal pieces and suck them out with a vacuum cleaner. There's only one group that can be killed, not only harmed, but killed without equal protection, with impunity, basically, a slap on the wrist or nothing when it comes to the mother, and that is the unborn. It's not gay people, it's not black people, it's not this people, it's the unborn. So the unborn, we're not even living up to the 14th Amendment. And for the record, I like the 14th Amendment. Guys know that that I have some things that I would maybe want to repeal. The 14th Amendment's not one of them. I would just like to actually follow the 14th Amendment and apply it accurately. States, not private enterprises, and equal protection. And the only people who are not equally protected right now are the unborn, not some ethnic minority class. So that's my thoughts on that. But the Civil Rights Act went way further than the 14th Amendment. And that's exactly the Civil Rights Act. There's a straight line. It's not like, oh, we couldn't have seen it, or this is random, or I don't even. No, the straight line from the Civil Rights Act to diversity, equity, inclusion, wokeness, critical race theory, all of that came out of that. Wes, you want to make a comment real quick, and then we'll hear from our last sponsor.
It creates a de facto new constitution. Exactly. It goes Benjamin Franklin, correct me if I'm wrong. Well, what do we have? A democracy if we can keep it. We didn't keep it because we have a new constitution that now says...
Republic if you can keep it.
Republic if you can keep it. You did correct me. Good.
Good.
It now says, like the First Amendment says, that you have freedom. Congress shall not make any law abridging your freedom of religion, freedom of association. Well, now it is restricted. I want to start a men's only gym. No, you can't. I want to start a men's only golf club. No, you can't. There is a new protected statuses that they're literally above our Constitution.
For private business.
For private businesses, not just publicly or state, like you said.
Right.
Private businesses now have a new Constitution that is about 60 years old. So we are in a constitutional republic.
And that's why everybody's like, oh, my Constitution. It's like, we're not Constitution haters. I love the Constitution. Even with the people say, well, you don't love the Constitution because you deny the First Amendment. Well, because you're a Christian nationalist or you're a general equity theonomist. No, it's the same thing. With the First Amendment, look at the first word. And the same thing with the 14th, no state, right? Well, in the First Amendment, it's Congress shall make no law. So Congress could not make a law to have a federal, that is at the national level, to have a state church. But states, individual states could have churches, and out of the 13 original colonies, 10 of those 13 original colonies did have churches, and I'm not even advocating for a state church like the state of Texas Texas or the state of Connecticut. I don't even think that would be a good idea. But the only thing that the First Amendment says is that Congress, not individual states, but that Congress at the federal level nationally can't have a state church, where these United States are, Presbyterian Church of America, and that's that's the only thing that the First Amendment forbids. And then in terms of the equal right of worship, the founders, you have to take into it authorial intent into play. Like the founders were not saying, we want to carve out, when we say that there's not going to be persecution of religious expression, freedom of religion, we want to carve out necessary space in the Ohio State Capitol for a Satan statue.
Right.
That is not what they were thinking. They were thinking about different expressions of the Christian religion, different denominations. They were thinking, we don't want Episcopalians to be persecuted by the Presbyterians. We don't want Baptists to get the short end of the stick because of the Anglicans. That's what they were. It was a pan-Protestant movement. It was different denominations and sects of our common Lord, but it was all within Christianity. This was not freedom the founders did not come with a dream. We really hope that we'll have multiple principle pluralism and multiculturalism, to where one day 25% of the population will be Satanists, and 25% of them will be atheists, and 25% of them will be Hindu, and 25% of them might be Christian. That is not what's baked into the First Amendment. So I like the 14th Amendment. I like the First Amendment. I think we need to get back to what they actually mean. The Civil Rights Act, however, is not the 14th Amendment. If it was, then it would be redundant. We already had it. Why wasn't the 14th Amendment good enough? But they realized it's not good enough. We need to go one step further and apply this to private enterprise and push. And then the Civil Rights movement, not only is it wrongly applied on the ethnic issue, but then it becomes the diving board, the launching pad for the sexual issue and sexual orientation. And then all of a sudden, pretty quickly, in the big scheme of history, just 60 years, here we are. And is the world better? I mean, even not just the world and not just our nation in a general sense, but is the black community better for the Civil Rights Act? Is the black community better?
Racial relations
in
improved?
20? Yeah. Are we more racial? Where's the racial reconciliation? We're racially reconciled now, huh? No, there's more racism. We got most people pretty much got over it. They've done statistics and polls and all these kinds of things. You look in the 1980s and 1990s, people were like, nobody cared. Everybody was pretty much over it. But then the Civil Rights Act gets weaponized, and it was always sitting there as a ticking time bomb, ready for this exact moment. It begins to get weaponized by the same people who pushed it across the finish line in the first place, aka the Marxists. And here come these Marxists, and they dust it off and they repurpose it and say, oh, there's a new application, and here we go. And then boom, BLM 2020, all this, and now you look and you're like, man, we haven't gotten better on race relations since the 80s and the 90s. Right. Things have been substantially worse. Right. And substantially worse, ironically, for everybody, but for the black community. The black community was thriving before the Civil Rights Act. There was, again, we talked about that in the beginning of the episode, but marriages remained intact at like close to 90. Thomas Sowell talks about this, 90 percentile, even more intact marriages long-term than even within the white community. People were thriving, and then it got demolished. And Lyndon B. Johnson, I believe it's Johnson, right, who allegedly said, with this legislation, I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Yep.
And real hero of rights.
And the legislation being welfare.
Right.
What were you saying, Wes? Go ahead.
No, his great society, it decimated. It was trillions and trillions of dollars all said and done to make people way worse off than when it started.
Yeah. So some nefarious things, and we need to know. These are things that are important to know. We're not saying this in order to overreact and say, all right, so let's just become neo-Nazis and white supremacists. No, that's not helpful. But we are saying this to say, look, our current problem. If you think our current problem is white supremacy, then I got a bridge to sell you. You're stupid. Seriously, you need to wake up, take that as a pastoral rebuke. If you think, I'm not saying that you have to believe that no one is a white supremacist, but if you think the headline issue in American society today is white supremacy, then you are an idiot. You're a fool. Yeah. You may not be wicked or sinister or malicious in your motives and intent, but you have been played like a fiddle. You should feel ashamed. You should feel foolish. You are a fool. Right now, white supremacy is not the headline. It may be way down buried in the footnotes as, yes, technically there are, 13 white supremacists over here in a corner of this state.
In a trailer park in Alabama.
Yeah, in a trailer park in Alabama with absolutely no money and no power, no influence to speak of. But the headline of the story is not white supremacy. The headline of the story today, if anything, is white racism. It's racism against white people, and not racism, but it's prejudice against whites. It's prejudice against males. It's prejudice against heterosexuality, and it's prejudice against evangelical Christians.
Yeah.
If you want to actually be despised, then be a white male heterosexual evangelical Christian in America.
Yeah.
That's them's the facts.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go ahead and keep going.
You want to go to a break?
Oh, yeah, we got to go to a break. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. Here's our last sponsor of the day.
The danger of centralized power is often represented by the word king. As Americans, we hate the word king. Civilian ownership of body armor is about helping people to have increased power to resist tyrants and criminals. And so, Armored Republic is about helping you to preserve your God-given rights to the honor of the Lord Jesus Christ, because he is the King of Kings, and he governs kings and he will judge them. This is Armored Republic, and in a republic, there is no king but Christ. We are free craftsmen, and we are honored to be your armorsmith of choice.
Great. Well, wrapping it up, we talked about Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Act, what that's kind of created, a new constitution. Just to give a practical example of the way this manifests very recently. So the Civil Rights Act created these protected classes. You cannot be discriminated on the basis of race and of sex, of national origin, etc. I believe there's 6 total. Bostock versus Clayton County. This was a Supreme Court case in 2020. The Supreme Court ruled, so this would have been at the time, I think it had a 5-4 liberal split. So this would have been before the last justice, Amy Coney Barrett. They decided that in that term sex, so discrimination on the basis of sex is not allowed. What that includes with it is gender identity, whatever that means, and sexual orientation, again, whatever that means. So that now means, say you run a business, you cannot fire someone on that basis. This individual is making people uncomfortable, this or the other. You would get a lawsuit as fast as you can see. And I think about Kim Davis. She's might have been the cake or it might have been another service. And these gay individuals targeted her, came in and demanded that she make paraphernalia for them or for their wedding.
On purpose. They wanted her business because they knew she wouldn't do it and they wanted to ruin her life.
And now the First Amendment says that she has freedom of religion, right? Wrong. This new constitution then said, and I believe it was decided in her favor, but now she's facing $300,000 worth of legal fees to be able to practice her religion. Right. We can get into it, but that's really what this creates, is a new religion, a DEI, a wokeness religion. Yep. It has its creeds, it has its high figures, its Kendys, its Jamar Tisbys. It has its high figures, its creeds, its sacraments, its texts. It has all of these different things functionally in place of what was once a Christian nation.
Right. And it's not just a new religion. It really is. The Civil Rights Act became, as Christopher Caldwell says in The Age of Entitlement, it became a new constitution.
Yep.
And I like the way that he describes it. He says the Constitution was so intact in our nation and so revered. And a lot of people still, pay it lip service and tip of the hat, and salute the Constitution and optically, externally appear to revere the Constitution. So even to this day. But because of that, because of so much reverence for the Constitution, which even I possess. I love the Constitution. Right. Yeah. I just the difference between me and the classical liberal who wants to get back to the 1980s, who's anti-woke but hates Christian nationalism and is like Christ is Lord but not really. The difference between me and that guy, you fill in the blank. I won't name him, but there's a lot of them. Is not that they love the Constitution and I don't. It's that I know what time it is and they don't. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I'm saying is not that the Constitution is flawed. What I'm saying is that we don't have the Constitution. Yeah. Everybody still pays it lip service and pretends to revere it. But as Christopher Caldwell, I think rightly describes, he says the Constitution was so revered, you couldn't get rid of it. You couldn't blow it up. You couldn't replace it. So what you had to do was you had to create a de facto, is what he calls it, a de facto constitution that doesn't replace it, but just sits over the actual Constitution like a glass case. But it becomes the new reference point from then on. And so it's like we're not going to blow up the Constitution. Oh, we love the Constitution, but you're going to put it under this de facto new Constitution that's like a glass case, but it's like a glass case that's tinted, like a different color lens. And so we're going to put it over. And now every time we're still using the original Constitution, but from now on, whenever we read the Constitution actually says this, but we see it saying that, right? So the 14th Amendment still says what it always said since its reception. But now when we read the 14th Amendment, we read Civil Rights Act. And then when you read the Civil Rights Act, you now read DEI, know, and LGBT, LMNOP. So that's the problem. So it's not that, Christian nationalists hate the Constitution or this or that. The Republic's great if you can keep it. The difference between the Christian nationalists and the classical liberal, Christian guy who hates wokeness, but doesn't really want to go all the way and do what we need to do for Christ Jesus to truly be Lord, not just in a private, ethereal, spiritual 17th dimension way, but in a real, tangible, political way. The difference between the Christian nationalists or whatever you want to call it, like there are different things, Christian nationalists, but the difference between that guy and the guy who wants to turn back the clock to the 1980s is not that one loves the Constitution and the other doesn't. It's just realizing what time it is. We're going to say, a republic in terms of form of government, and that's different than the Constitution. That opens another conversation. But in terms of forms of government, I think that a constitutional republic is a great form of government. Yeah. I don't think that it's explicitly prescribed in Scripture to where any other form of government is inherently sinful. I don't think that. I do believe that God can use a monarchy. I believe that God. But I do like, if you're asking me what I think is good and what I think I can defend really well from Scripture, a constitutional republic I think is great. A raw democracy I think is probably the worst form of government, and I think actually would be inherently sinful. Every biblical example of the people, just raw vote of the people, is Pilate giving it to the people. What do you want to do? Kill the Son of God, Jesus, or like in Israel, what do you want to do? The people, give us a king, at every single level. Or what do you want to do? You just got out of Egypt. Moses is up on the mountain. He's been gone a while. The people said, let's start idolatry and make this golden calf. So anytime you see the people voting on something or pressuring something, it's all like universally negative in the Scripture. So raw democracy, I think, is a really bad idea. But I do like a constitutional republic. The difference, though, again, is we're sitting here saying we like a constitutional republic as a form of government, and we like our Constitution with these United States. But the difference is we're just saying, but the Constitution has not been the law of the land for a very long time.
Well, the irony there, Joel, is there's a lot of Christians who get, like you just said, really concerned and upset about the idea of Christian nationalism. And then the straw man comes, well, you want a theocracy. The reality is I was researching this and reading Caldwell's book and just kind of thinking through, in a sense, we currently do live in a theocracy.
Yeah.
There is a religion of diversity, equity, and inclusion that came through the hammer of the government, through the civil rights legislation, and then the pressure on businesses and states and individual citizens. And so the irony is we live in something much closer to a theocracy right now than really we ever have at any point in American history. And the reason why I bring this up is because this is a Christian issue. This is an issue for pastors to think about. It's almost impossible to think about civic duty or love of neighbor, so the political good and the good that we ought to do because we are Christians. It's almost impossible to think about civic duty and love of neighbor without seeing it, like you just said, through the lens of what is this doing about minorities? What is this doing about the so-called oppressed around me?
Or even that is the our country. What is this doing about immigrants?
Correct. That is the litmus test, the baseline, and really the final arbiter of whether or not something is good legal policy and good Christian teaching.
We'll tell this story too. We're always telling stories about ourselves, events, but we'll tell this story about America through that new lens that at its founding, America made this radical promise. No matter who you were, where you came from, what you are, you had the right to life, liberty, freedom, pursuit of happiness. It made this promise, but it was racist and it needed a civil war. And then it needed the women's suffrage movement. And then it needed the civil rights. And now, see, in the whole thing, progress for 200 years is the virtue. Progress, 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 more rights, more openness, more inclusion. Well, now we're at the stage where we need to open it to, supposedly, unnatural unions. After all, if we had 200 years of progress of trying to make good on this promise that we made to anyone who would come to America, well, why not the next stage? So the conservative, he's like 15 minutes behind. Like, no, enough progress. But we're telling the story, and that train doesn't stop. And if you have that vocabulary, you kind of talk in that way, like, well, America was this racist nation, and we had to do all this work. Well, stop it. That's not the story of America. We were a godly nation on Christian principles that aimed to be a city on a hill. And do not make one of the most massive footnotes the massive headline. That is not the story of America. And conservatives will even tell that story.
Yeah.
Right.
About America.
Yep. No, you're right. Yeah, conservatives. John Doyle is somebody interesting. He's got a YouTube channel. You can check him out. I just was talking to you guys, asked if you listened to him before we started recording. You said you did, and I wasn't curious, I wasn't certain about his Christian faith. He talks about being a Christian. You guys said he's Catholic,
I believe so.
So if he says something against the five solas, take it with a grain of salt. But other than that, he's got some incredible commentary. He's highly intelligent, very well spoken, young. He seems like he's a Zoomer, but he's very intelligent and very well read and very informed. But he made a joke on one of his recent videos that I thought was hilarious. And it was in reference to, Martin Luther King and the subject of this video. He said, in 15 years, I can't remember the number of years, but, he said in the future and not that far from now, you'll have guys, this is just the nature of conservatives because they're losers. But you'll have guys who will say like, I'm a George Floyd conservative, right? And he said, that is how conservatives of the day during Martin Luther King's time would have thought of us now. They would have said, you cowardly pushover fool.
Yeah.
You're a Martin Luther King conservative? Like, what are you talking about? He was a Marxist, an adulterer. He was used to push for the Civil Rights Act that took away our freedoms, this, that, and the other. Right? It'd be like, okay, I'm gonna say it. So George Floyd, conservative, right? And John Doyle, he even said, conservatives will say, well, really, but he was standing up against fiat currency by using a fake counterfeit $20 bill. He's a conservative. I'm a George Floyd conservative. And he was calling for his mom, right? So still a strong sense of family ties. But it's funny, but it's sad because he's probably right. 20 years from now, conservatives will be, I'm a George Floyd conservative, and that's the same as people today saying I'm a Michael Martin Luther King conservative, and it's the same as people 50 years ago saying I'm an Abraham Lincoln conservative. Abraham Lincoln was not a conservative. He was not. I would say that other than maybe Obama, Joe Biden is terrible, but he's a corpse, and it's really the puppets using him. I think that's more of a regime thing than it is Biden. So I think in terms of the actual presidents, I think that Obama is worse than Biden. And this is Obama's third term. So I think Obama is worse than Biden. But I think other than Obama, Abraham Lincoln is for me, would be up there. Woodrow Wilson would be also in there. Lyndon B. Johnson would be in there. But other than a few of those guys, I'd say top 5 worst presidents, Abraham Lincoln would be in my top 5 in terms of destroying the fabric of the nation.
And what's so interesting about that too is a lot of the legislation that came out of the Civil War was so badly considered, right? I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation with no plan of what to do about all of these emancipated former slaves. I mean, in a lot of ways, Jim Crow was a result of a very poorly considered Emancipation Proclamation.
Right. And if it was just about the slaves, then they could have spent less money. It would have been cheaper buy every single slave in the United States and set them free. And you could have bought all of them and given them something to start with. But it wasn't fundamentally about slavery. I'm not saying slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War. But if you think that it wasn't also political in moving away from federalism, the decentralization of civil power to the states and moving it towards a national government, centralizing power, that was one of the fundamental issues. and the North won, and the Confederacy lost, and the nation changed forever. So I'm not on team pro-slavery over here, at least certainly not a race-based, lifelong, that kind of slavery. Indentured servanthood for someone who's in debt in order to pay off their debts, a biblical, fine. Right. But my point is, I'm not over here saying the fabric of the nation was changed because we lost slaves. No, I'm saying the fabric of the nation was changed in terms of civil power, and political power, and the way that it was exercised, and it was changed for the worse, not for the better. And if it really was just about slavery, 12 different nations, Western nations, ended slavery. We're the only one that did it at the cost of the lives of 650,000 people in a war, right? All these other people were able, all these other nations were able to end slavery peacefully. How come ours was a bloodbath? How come it was still, that's not a coincidence. It's not that we're the only people who wanted to, the nation that wanted to end slavery. Everybody else, all these other Western nations, they wanted to end it too. They did end it, and they ended it peacefully. But we ended it with blood. And I think if we think it's just merely a coincidence that we ended slavery violently, and that's not one of the reasons why we have the worst race relations of Western nations currently, I think it's Doug Wilson has said this, so I don't want to sit here and pretend like I'm invented the wheel for the first time and being original. But he said he believes that our current race relations is God's judgment for the Civil War.
Yeah. Listen to this quote from Robert E. Lee. I haven't verified it, but I believe it to be true. He said, "The consolidation of the states into one vast empire, sure to be aggressive abroad and despotic at home, will be the certain precursor of ruin which has overwhelmed all that preceded it." Yeah. Yep. He saw, if you consolidate all of that, you will set the precedent for civil rights, and a new regime or a new idea will sweep the nation, and the federal government will have everything in its power to enforce it.
Yep, you're absolutely right. So my point is, you could go from the Civil War and what Lincoln did, and draw a line from that, to civil rights, and draw a line from that to DEI and wokeness. And so the point is, history matters, and what we're trying to say is to avoid 15 years from now being George Floyd conservatives. That's embarrassing. Yep. That's not where I want to be, right? That's not where you want to be when Jesus comes back, a George Floyd conservative. So in order to avoid that fateful end, we want to say we can't do what conservatives always do. And here's what conservatives always do. They do a lot of lousy things, but here's one of them. They say stop. They say, leave me alone, or even, don't tread on me, which is ultimately, that's not a threat of executing power justly against the wicked. Don't tread on me is just a antiquated way of saying, leave me alone. And it's been said many times, but it's true. The side that wants to take over is always going to, that wants to win is always going to beat the side that wants to just be left alone. And so conservatives, we can't just be, don't mess with me, or don't tread on me, leave me alone. We actually have to have a plan. We have to be able to wield power. Power is not inherently wrong. It's wrong if you're using power wickedly. It's good if you're using it righteously. So we need to embrace power, pick it up, and use it against the enemies of God and those who do things wickedly. But then secondly, we also have to go back. We can't. Conservatives, what they always say is they say, stop.
Or here.
Stop here. Yeah, exactly. A conservative will spend his life fighting for the victories of yesterday's liberal.
Yep.
That's what a conservative does. Yep. A conservative, all a conservative is, he's no different than a progressive. He's just yesterday's progressive. Yep. That's all he is. He is literally giving his life to cement the victories of his dad's his dad's enemies. Yeah. And not even his dad's in some cases, like his older brother who's only 3 years older than him. So anyway, how do we actually get back to righteousness? Well, we can't just go back 15 minutes, and we can't just say, you know what, this is enough righteousness. We just don't. Our goal is not to say we don't want any more wickedness. Our goal is to say the current wickedness that we have is wicked, and we want to get rid of that. So we don't want to just say stop here, no further. We want to actually go back and say, where did we get off the rails? And we didn't just get off the rails in the 2020s. Right. We didn't just get off the rails 3 years ago with COVID. All these were just signs of something that had been set up and allowed for for really, if we go back far enough, even outside of these United States, within just the West in a larger sense for centuries. And so those are the things that we want to discuss. And today we focus our attention on MLK and civil rights. And I hope that it's been helpful. Any final thoughts from you guys?
I want to say, MLK is compelling because he's been cast as a heroic figure. And Wes, you mentioned earlier that we need stories, right? And we need to be honest as Christians, but we also need better mythological people. We need to be not creating, but telling and retelling even nationally virtuous, heroic stories. And certainly as Christians, we need to be putting forward, creating, writing, telling, reinforcing, commending to our children and our neighbors stories of true virtue, of true righteousness, of true civic, national worth and merit. And part of the reasons why conservatives are losing is because we're not telling good stories anymore. Yeah. And MLK has been fashioned as a compelling story, and so we buy it.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
One final practical thought. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of blood, sweat, and tears by God's grace to hopefully see the Civil Rights Act overturned or replaced with something righteous in its place. Yeah. But speaking practically, if you're a business owner and you're like, I don't want this Constitution hanging over my head, well, cases like this, they'll go up to district and circuit courts. And do you know who appointed a lot of great conservative judges, hundreds of them? Donald Trump. And so next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about voting for Donald Trump as a Christian. Can you? Should you?
Yeah, and what's a good case for it? No, yeah, that's a good teaser for next week. And speaking of Trump, one thing with MLK or Abraham Lincoln or JFK, one way to be viewed within history sympathetically is to get assassinated. And Donald J. Trump, man, if I could think of anybody who legitimately might get assassinated.
You know what I heard someone the other day said his best bet is to pick a VP, if he's the nominee, who's more conservative and right-wing than him.
Right.
Because then if they assassinate Trump, they're stuck with someone even worse than him.
Yeah, that would be
good idea.
That'd be a good goal. All right, well, thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you guys again at 4 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday next week. And just if you're joining us for the first time, here's the lay of the land. We have 3 shows a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So Monday, and it's all 4 p.m. Central Time. And it's on Twitter and on YouTube, whatever you want to use. So Monday at 4 p.m. Central Time, that's where I interview somebody remotely. And so we call that the interview. And then we call this the live stream. So that's Wednesday at 4 p.m. Central Time, both, again, Twitter and YouTube. That's me and Wesley Todd and Michael Belch. And then lastly, Friday at 4 p.m. Central Time, that's called The Special. And that's where I fly notable guests from all over to join me for a deep dive where we do multiple episodes on a whole season. And so right now we've got that going with Andrew Isker and A.D. Robles and myself. It's a 9-part series. We've released the first 2 episodes, and on Friday, the 3rd episode will air. But 9 episodes, all on Andrew Isker's book, The Boniface Option. So that's Friday at 4 p.m. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 4 p.m. Central Time. You've got the interview, the live stream, and the special. So come and check us out, Twitter or YouTube. All right.